Okay, thank you. Thank you all for coming here. My name is Stefan Olsson. I'm the director for Frivärld, Stockholm Free World Forum. And for our last session, we will bring up the broad issues, I believe, and the questions no one dared to ask. And when I talked to you earlier, I mentioned that this is not a government-sponsored conference in any way, so there's no reason to be polite. And at least some of you replied, well, good, because that's why we left public office. So, let me introduce the panel. We have a whole American panel, actually. It's Kurt Volker. He's the director of the McCain Institute and former US ambassador to NATO. And we have Matthew Bryza from the International Center of Defense Studies in Tallinn and a former US diplomat, right?
US ambassador to Azerbaijan.
Oh, okay. And we have Bruce Acker, who is a former defense attaché at the US Embassy in Stockholm, and now independent consultant.
Yes.
Yes. And so I give the word to you, the floor to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to stand up, as some other speakers have done. It's late in the day, everybody's bored. First off, thank you very much for inviting me here and for the opportunity. I think it's a great initiative. Second, advertising. About a year ago, I edited a book on Nordic-Baltic-US cooperation together with a Latvian colleague and financed largely by the Swedish Foreign Ministry, and a couple of people who are here were contributors to that book. And so it's available at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies Center for Transatlantic Relations website, CTR. And you can download most of it there as well, and there's some good recommendations in that. Also, you mentioned the McCain Institute that I'm now leading in Washington. Its focus is character-driven leadership. And I think you'll find a lot of unique and interesting things there compared to a lot of other think tanks, because it is nonpartisan and yet explicitly values-based as an approach to promoting good policymaking in national security, human rights, and humanitarian affairs. And I look for partnerships with any of you who find things that we can do together. Third, I want to congratulate the Free World Conference, Free World Symposium, for choice of language, because we, I think, have gotten to the point of political correctness in Europe and the United States that we don't like to say freedom, free world, leader of the free world, promoting democracy.
Yeah, you violated political correctness.
Is it this one on? Yes.
It's the battery, I think, is gone. Yeah. So,
Yeah, you can use that mic.
I'm a captive to...
I think oh, do you want to use mine?
All right. Great. So anyway, I think we have gone to the excess of political correctness in our choice of language, so that we don't say the important, obvious things. So calling things free or not free, talking about democracy, having a conference about the free world, congratulations, it's a very important step. We have to reclaim the vocabulary. Next, I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about where the rest of the world is. Most of what you've heard today has been discussion about the Nordic-Baltic region or about Russia and Russia's views about the region. So I'm going to take a step back from that and give a little context and then kind of walk back into the region. First off, the United States. I find myself saying these days that we are living in my lifetime, a unique period in American foreign policy history. I grew up going to graduate school and college, reading about isolationism, these tendencies in the US to pull back between the great oceans. And I had to say, I never experienced it in my lifetime. My first political awareness of foreign policy was in the Carter administration, Iran hostage crisis. We had the Reagan administration, George H.W. Bush, fall of the Berlin Wall, NATO enlargement. Clinton, for a brief period, played with "it's the economy, stupid," but he ended up saving Bosnia and Kosovo. In the Bush administration, he originally talked about, we're not going to do nation building abroad until 9/11, and then we decided we needed to do nation building abroad. This is the first time where I see the U.S. actively pulling back from foreign engagement around the world, but especially Europe and the Middle East, not thinking of military force as a key part of the arsenal of tools in the toolbox that we have for foreign policy. And I see this not only from the administration, but also a substantial part of the Republican Party now also thinking we need to be focusing on at home. Why are we involved in these long wars and engagements? We can't afford these things. How does this stuff affect us? Those people should take care of themselves. So it is really a unique moment for me to see this happening. I'm quite concerned about it because my view is that as the United States pulls back from engagement in the world, no one else is in a position to lead. Europe particularly is rather weak economically, politically, militarily, for a variety of reasons that you all know. And therefore, the problems and crises that we have, which have not gone away, have the opportunity to fester, multiply, get worse. And we see that in the Maghreb, in the Sahel, in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, next year in Afghanistan, and so on. So I'm quite concerned about this part of the United States, and I'll come back to implications for the Nordic-Baltic region in a second. I just said that I think Europe is weak on many fronts. There's a much lower degree of solidarity within Europe now than there was before the start of the Eurozone crisis. There's a feeling of being financially strapped in most countries in Europe, not Germany and not here, not Estonia, but take a look around the rest of Europe, and there's a great deal of concern that things can't be done. There is a mysticism about soft power, which I would argue, I think we have to stop saying the word soft power. There is influence. Matt and I were talking about this. There's influence that you can exercise through a variety of cultural, financial, and diplomatic and other means. And then there's power, and that is the imposition of what you want. And I think we have begun to confuse the two to our own detriment because others in the world are willing to use real power to achieve their objectives. I don't see Europe willing to confront issues of power. And in fact, in one of the sessions in Tallinn that we had at the Leonard Mary Conference, one of the speakers there was again resorting to the fallback of soft power when she didn't know what else to say about Syria. So we'll use soft power, whatever that means. One of the issues that came up earlier, and I wanted to touch on it in part because it was under-discussed at the Leonard Mary Conference, was the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. This is the idea of expanding the economic relationship dramatically from both sides of the Atlantic. It can be seen perhaps in the context of supporting democracy and free markets in a global liberal economy in the face of rising China or mercantilism from Brazil or in India or elsewhere. That said, I'm quite skeptical that this is going to succeed because the issues principally dividing the US and European economies boil down to regulatory ones that affect things like food safety, GMOs, pharmaceutical approvals, who gets to decide what drugs we can take, automobile subsidies, agricultural subsidies, data protection and privacy protection, financial services. And these are ones where both Europeans and Americans cling to our own systems. We're not really enamored of the idea of adopting the other side's regulations. And I think the notion that people put forward is, well, you don't have to do that, you just have to have mutual recognition of each other's standards. I'm skeptical of that as well because there's no accountability in that. You can't tell a woman in Kansas who took some drugs that made her terribly ill that, well, it was approved by the European drug authorities. It's not going to fly in the US, and I'm sure it wouldn't fly in Europe either, the other way around. So I think this is a lot harder than it has made out to be. And that's a troubling thought because on the one hand, it is a tremendously good idea, and I hope that we can get there, but I'm just very skeptical. But moreover, if this also doesn't deliver on a US-European agenda, there isn't anything else out there at the moment. And that's a troubling thought, that we haven't got a broad-based sense of partnership with an alliance with all of Europe in dealing with the many significant challenges that we face. Outside of the United States and Europe, I know in the United States it is quite commonplace and popular to dismiss Europe as yesterday, aging, overregulated, constipated, whatever you would say, just not relevant for our considering. At the same time, where else do you turn in the United States if you need partners and allies to deal with global challenges? There isn't any other place that you can readily turn to. So it's actually critically important that we do more to engage the US and Europe together on challenges. Now, how does that apply when you turn back to the Nordic-Baltic region? Well, you were asked about sequester. The US is cutting $50 billion or so out of its defense budget this year and likely to do so every year for the foreseeable future. And in fact, to the extent we are able to manage our own fiscal problems, which I'm not sure that we will in the short term, next 3 to 4 years, but if we do, it will involve reforming Social Security, Medicare, and the tax code. And if we do that, there's no doing that without further cuts in defense, just as a political price to pay for getting it done. That means that not only have we decided to participate in steadfast jazz at the level of 190 people, but that pattern is likely to continue. The 3rd Brigade that was promised for reinforcement and exercising with Europe as a compensation for pulling 2 US brigades out of Europe, that 3rd Brigade is probably not going to be fully funded and probably not taking part in as many exercises as we had originally hoped for. So these are a lot of worries coming from the US dealing with this region. Within Europe, I don't see any change to the basic pattern of reducing defense spending and capabilities. And as a result of that, in many countries, reinterpreting or imposing an imprint on the world around Europe that doesn't correspond to reality, but makes it easier to justify the cuts in defense spending and the politics that go with that. If I could give a couple of forward suggestions, or do you want to come to that in the Q&A perhaps?
Yeah, we'll move on to the...
We'll move on to the Q&A and then I have a couple ideas.
Yeah, sure.
I just don't want to leave everyone depressed.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Please, Matthew.
Stefan. Well, I'm an optimist at heart, but I'm not going to be able to blunt so much of Kurt's pessimism today. But I won't talk about the United States so much until the question period. I'm going to try to refocus back on the Baltic-Nordic region or Nordic-Baltic region. Yeah, as Kurt said yesterday, we had, it seems like a million years ago, but at a Leonard Mary conference, among the discussions we had was with one particular person who, besides that statement, made a comment about, well, a question that was really rhetorical, which was, is there any utility at all for military force in this modern era of the Euro-Atlantic community? And yeah, and then the discussion became one of hard power versus soft power. And I think when it comes to this region, and if we're talking about threat perceptions and Russia, Ed Lucas made the point pretty compellingly today that from Moscow's perspective, there's just a continuum of types of power. And the power is exercised in many forms. It can be exercised through military threat. If you look at Russia's military doctrine, the number one enemy, the strategic enemy of Russia is identified as NATO. And if you look at NATO doctrine, Russia is seen as a strategic partner. So there's a huge imbalance here on threat perceptions. Take Boris Nemtsov's points that perhaps the bluster that we hear coming out of Moscow and President Putin about the fact that the West is the number one enemy and the United States, et cetera, maybe that's for domestic consumption, but at the end of the day, domestic consumption becomes foreign policy in many cases. And we can debate whether or not this Russia would ever be in a circumstance where it would contemplate actually using military force in this region where we are now. What's clear is that it's probing and looking for our responses. It's probing in the form of what our Norwegian colleague was talking about, the constant flights for years along Norway's coast in the high north. It was probing on Good Friday with the now very famous flight that came here to nearby Sweden. It was probing years ago on energy, when I felt, at least when Kurt and I were still working together at the White House, when I couldn't figure out why some of our biggest allies refused to stand up to the intimidation and pressure and bullying that Georgia was experiencing, and even before Mikhail Saakashvili was president, even under Shevardnadze, it was evident to me it was because of Gazprom. And the fear among some of Europe's most powerful politicians that you don't want to anger this supplier of your most important strategic commodity, whose mere threat not to renew a contract could be the end of your government, and whose cutoff of supplies could be physically catastrophic for people. So there's probing, and when there's not a response, I think we are just encouraging our friends or colleagues in Moscow to probe more, to push a bit more. I think, as someone mentioned earlier today, it was you, Mike, Secretary Kerry was kept waiting for 2.5 hours. I think it's hard. It would be hard for me to walk out of the office in that situation. I would hope I would. In any case, I think that was an example of probing too. How far can President Putin push the United States, make it, humiliate it, and will we come back for more? And we saw the next day, after Secretary Kerry was in Moscow, with the primary issue of the day being Syria, what happened? The next day, Russia announced the S-300s are going to Syria. So there's probing. Makarov's threats against Finland seemed absolutely outrageous to us in Washington last year, or wherever the heck I was, Istanbul. And yes, it does seem inconceivable that Russia would actually use force in this part of the world, unless you went through what I went through in the Bush administration in 2008, when, throughout the period from 2005 to 2008, among my various responsibilities was conflict mediation. I'm such a great diplomat. Look at my successes. I mean, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Cyprus, Nagorno-Karabakh. I just vividly remember a conversation I was having with my British counterpart. I won't say his name. If people really watch this, you'll know. But we had something called the Group of Friends of Georgia. And so the real friends, is the way I looked at it, were German, French, British, and American. And then we'd talk together, and then we'd meet with the Russians to be politically correct, and we'd try to de-escalate tension. My British colleague pulled me aside after I said, I think we're losing the ability to influence Mikhail Saakashvili. I think he feels he's being backed into a corner by President Putin with the steps underway to prepare for a military incursion into Georgia, whether it was the railroad that was being upgraded across Abkhazia or the downing of Georgian surveillance drones. And I said that in front of our larger group, and then my British colleague pulled me aside. He said, "Matt, let's go have a beer." And he sat me down, he looked deep into my eyes, he said, "Matt, are you insane? Have you lost your mind? This is impossible." And well, a year and a half later, it was possible, and there were Russian troops invading. So, yeah, history is not deterministic in this sense. I mean, I would hope that no one would ever dare to exercise the actual use of military force in our region. But what Minister Pabriks was talking about earlier, the indefensibility perception that is prevalent, certainly in Estonia, where I spend part of my time, it has real costs. It has costs to our alliance, and it has costs to our ability to counter, whether you want to call it soft power, or hard power, or cybersecurity power, or energy bullying. It has costs in this mechanical way. In Estonia, maybe more than in Finland, there's an obsession with territorial defense, with national defense, and never again will we Estonians not fight back. And so you get, for our institute, some studies that strike me as incredible and outrageous and almost silly. How many hospital beds would be required if Russia invaded Estonia? And the answer is simple. You don't need anyone to analyze this. The answer is there's no amount that's sufficient, because if the Russians really invaded, there's nothing you can do really to withstand such an assault. But what happens is you get a lack of strategic vision and strategic planning and rational procurement in the Estonian defense sector. And by the way, they're my paymaster. They fund pretty much 100% of my institute, but they encourage me to be critical, so I'm being critical. You get a perspective that makes the Estonian MOD incapable of planning for procurement, for research and development, in a way that plays to what Estonia's strength should be, which is niche capabilities, right, and smart defense. Instead, the military budget is weighed down by the need to prepare conscript class after conscript class in a large military reserve. And so Estonia doesn't emerge as it should be, a niche provider, even though it's done such a great job in Helmand with our British allies in Afghanistan. And that then degrades the ability of NATO to provide the deterrence that I think we're all arguing is necessary. I'm almost done here. To get a little bit more pessimistic, I'd like to think a little bit out loud about the utility of NATO now from the perspective of our countries in the Baltic Nordic region. As Carlos was saying, there's a significant concern or a warranted concern about whether really Article 5 is as strong as we would like it to be or is perceived as such, given the fact that without Sweden in NATO, one could question whether or not NATO could actually respond to a military contingency in the Baltic states. In Estonia, this is a real concern, and there's genuine doubt about the viability or integrity of Article 5. It's something that's hard for me even to say. It's, to me, my national security religion is founded upon Article 5. Growing up the same time as Kurt, taking a lot of the same classes. But it's a genuine concern in Estonia that keeps the Estonians off balance, as I just described. And to descend a little bit more into pessimism, I'm just about done here. NATO now is stretched to its historic extremes in terms of its flanks, from the Arctic to Afghanistan. You could argue that the pullout from Afghanistan maybe will restore the balance of ends and means, and that could help restore or strengthen or sustain NATO's credibility in all the ways I'm describing. But what happens the day after or the year after or 3 years after? What happens if and when Afghanistan descends back into something horrible? And first and foremost, women and girls are living back in that terrible situation they were under the Taliban, not to mention many other people in the country. What does that do to NATO's reputation and its credibility, also in terms of Article 5? I hope Kurt, who knows infinitely more about NATO than I do, is going to tell me, Matt, are you insane? Of course everything's okay. That all said, what's the alternative? I mean, as we were discussing in a couple of panels ago, in fact, in response to my question, what else is there? What better security organization has ever existed than NATO to provide the coordination that's necessary, if we just look at the Baltic Nordic region, to bring all these varying perspectives and strategic perspectives on what the military should be used for? Without NATO, what organization can do that? And I would argue there's none, and that the urgency of NATO performing that function is as strong as ever. And so thank goodness we're here to talk about it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, back to optimism. First of all, thank you for inviting me, and it's an honor to share the stage with the people that have gone before me today and 2 American ambassadors. It's really an exciting opportunity. I'm going to look at things much more specifically from a defense perspective and not with the broad political perspective that the 2 ambassadors represent. But I've spent most of the day crossing off things that I don't need to say anymore because they've already been discussed today, or at least the foundation is there that we can go into the question and answer period later and maybe share some specific views on that. And rather, I'll just tell you what it is I experienced while I've been here and what that has for implications and where I think we're going to go in the future. I got here in 2007, and that was right after Sweden had a relatively historic change in government. And also the Defense Commission was underway. You had the first Nordic Battle Group. Everything that I did for for all 4 years was about cooperation of one sort or another. And starting with the Nordic Battle Group, which ironically was perceived with some degree of skepticism on the part of NATO and the American perspective, because we weren't really sure, is this going to be competitive to NATO or is it going to be cooperative? We worked our way through that eventually, but it took its time before we could really figure out what is Sweden up to. And of course, in the midst of that, we also had the Solidarity Declaration, which took everybody a little bit by surprise. As, well, what is this? Is this a back way into NATO, or is this a way to somehow get services that they weren't paying for? In the end, I mean, the foundation of that is absolutely correct, and we've heard it said several times today. It's inconceivable that there would be such a crisis in this part of the world that everybody isn't involved with, and whether or not there are security guarantees or not, it's inconceivable that NATO and the United States wouldn't be involved and say, well, this we cannot have. Now, the difference, of course, is whose interests are NATO and the US defending when they come here? Would it be Swedish interests, or would it be coincidental American and NATO interests, which is an important distinction. But at any rate, those were the first couple of years that I was here, and it progressed until the last year or so. When I retired 2 years ago, it really heated up. The debate about the debate, the meta debate, should we have a debate about NATO, started to pick up, and it was somewhat hysterical. Not hysterical funny, but as in hysteria. We can't defend ourselves. We can only defend ourselves for a week in a certain set of circumstances, or we didn't intercept this airplane that flew by, or most recently, Prime Minister Reinfeldt doesn't know what he's talking about when he talks about Russian capabilities, and most of that is taken out of context and exaggerated from my point of view. But that doesn't mean it's incorrect. It just means that, well, you have to put that in the context of the reality at the time. So that's what brings me to date, is that we've got this conference going on today. It's lifting up these questions so we can look at the same facts and kick through them and say, okay, what do these really mean? What are the consequences of this? What does it mean if you can only defend yourself for a week in a specific set of circumstances? What are there for strategic objectives on the part of the Russians or any other potential chaos maker in the region? So I think I started off by saying, let's return to optimism. I'm a cold warrior, so the optimism isn't mine. I mean, I still have this same thought process that all the rest of the Cold Warriors have, that, okay, I grew up in an environment where the Russians or the Soviets were the threat. They were the problem. And it's really hard to shake that. But what I look around the audience, I see a lot of young faces. That's where the optimism is. And you should expect in the years and decades to follow that people like us are going to be the ones, our responsibility is going to make sure you don't run with scissors or play in traffic. But eventually you're going to have to take over, and that is the optimism for the future. You don't have that memory that we have, and you're going to be able to think about things a little bit more openly and perhaps come to a solution where you can agree with the Russians that, okay, let's go from hard power to economic power and eventually cooperation. We can't do it because the suspicions are too deep. You might be able to do it, but a lot of the older people, the people with greater experience in the audience are going to try and say, well, wait a minute, we've tried that before. That's not so fast. Put those scissors down. Run with them point down for a little while. You know, so that's where I see this being a very valuable forum to get these questions out, kick them around. The old guys can say, that's dangerous. That'll never work. The young people will say, but we're never going to get through this problem if we don't start thinking more optimistically. So that's where my optimism comes from. Turn it over to you guys. Use our experience, and if you get tired of us, then vote in a new crowd.
Okay, thank you. Now it's obvious that the defense of Europe is the leader of defense of Europe is the United States, and it used to be so during the Cold War too. So what has actually changed? Isn't this the same old, but in a new context? Bruce, you were a Cold Warrior, you said.
Yes, but it was different then. I mean, we used to deal with territorial ambitions, ideological ambitions, and those have died down. They're not gone, but we're in a new era now where we're competing over different things, and they're largely economic challenges. And there are those that will say, well, we fought countless wars throughout history on economic issues. True enough. But there are some enduring facts, and from my perspective, is that you don't force open lines of communication. You can force them closed. But take, for example, the gas line from Russia to Germany. You can't at gunpoint sell gas to Germany. So to think that you're going to do that violently is the wrong mindset. And so, yes, the United States and NATO still play a very dominant role in securing this area, but it's not with the same conditions that it was before when we were talking about territory and ideology.
Okay, and passing on to you,
Sure.
Matt. Still, United States taxpayers pay a greater share of the common defense here.
Yeah, well, that's true. Well, a couple of remarks on that. One, a lot of American taxpayers benefit from the expenditures as well. I mean, our defense manufacturers are very significant in Congress. But I think what's much more significant than that quasi-Marxist argument is that the United States has, as Kurt was saying, has decided that it really doesn't know if it wants to lead anymore in Europe. I'm nonpartisan. I mean, I've worked with Kurt very closely with President Bush. I got nominated by President Obama. I've never belonged to any political party, but I'm deeply disappointed with where we are now in terms of a lack of interest in Europe. And Kurt will probably talk about an even broader lack of interest. But I just recall before I went out to Baku, when I was still working in the State Department in Washington, how often I heard, well, there's not interest in these issues in the South Caucasus or in Europe. USAID, for example, was gutting its budget. In fact, taking the resources that were allocated to advancing political and economic reform in Eastern Partnership countries and in Central Asia, and shifting that elsewhere to the priorities, Afghanistan and to Iraq and to India, right, South Asia, and I recall back when wonderful Ron Asmus, whom we all miss, organized a letter writing campaign of Central and Eastern European countries early in the Obama administration. You remember that? Because our friends, our allies were upset, in some cases furious, when our administration decided on, of all days, was September 17th, the 70th anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Poland after the Nazis had already invaded, that was when we would announce, rather than consult with Poland, that we were canceling missile defense in Poland. Just such insensitivity and lack of interest in the sensitivities of our allies, that it led a bunch of Eastern European and Central European countries to write a letter to the administration saying, what's happening? And have you forgotten about your closest friends? We're the ones that really care about you and need you. And the response was unbelievable. I'll just leave it at this. One of our colleagues, said to me, these countries, and this was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, these little countries need to realize that the big guys call the shots, right? And we've got a lot on the plate with Russia. And to me, I mean, that was just repulsive for all sorts of whatever moral reasons or political reasons, but also it's exactly the wrong way to deal with Russia. Russia is probing on energy, and I'll wrap it up with this. On energy, I'm always hearing, you've got such a confrontational approach you advocate toward Gazprom. All this competition is just going to get Gazprom angry. How is Gazprom going to reply? And how Gazprom has replied, as Anders was saying, is they've backed off. When greater competition has come into the northern European gas markets, thanks to gas trading hubs in the North Sea and LNG, Gazprom has been compelled to back off. So I'm not like some cowboy saying we ought to go out there and confront Russia at every turn. We don't want confrontation with Russia, but there's nothing wrong with competition. Competition is the way we're going to get Russia to be a true partner. Thanks.
Okay. And Kurt, you had ideas, you said, on how...
I do.
Yes.
So I'll come to those, and let me just add to Matt's last point, which is one that I wanted to bring up as well. This morning, I asked Minister Pabriks, and I think he gave an excellent answer as to what Russia's intentions are. Russia's not out to go attack anybody today, but they are trying to extend their influence. But I would add a point to that as I thought about it afterwards. Russia's intentions are dynamic, and they are shaped by what response they get. So if you push a little bit today and nobody does anything, you can push a little bit further. And if nobody does anything, you can push a little bit further again. So it's important that even when it's not